we have another evidence, worldwide flood, and whether or not catastrophism, or is it uniformitarianism, many ages, or quickly things happen. The evidences of past volcanism cannot be explained by uniformitarianism, where things are just trod along like we observe them in the present moment, and this is the way it's always been. A great part of the Earth's surface rocks are igneous in origin, in many different forms, and are often of tremendous extent, sometimes on the surface, sometimes intruded between sedimentary rocks. Intruded, we're talking about forced entry of molten igneous rocks, magma from volcanoes, into a rock formation, sometimes forming the base of a sedimentary series. These igneous rocks are found all over the world in great profusion. Often they are found intruding into previously deposited sedimentary rocks, like a cataclysmic intrusion, or on the surface covering vast areas of earlier deposits, as an intrusion. The Columbia Plateau of the northeast United States is a tremendous lava plateau of almost incredible thickness, covering about 200,000 square miles. The physiographic history of this province begins with the ancient surface before the lavas were erupted. This is known to have been locally rough, even mountainous, partly by the fact that some of the old peaks rose above the lava flood, which was at least several thousand feet deep. Wow, yes. So, N.M. Feynman, the physiography of the western United States, 1931. But they're still relevant. The great shields of the world, notably in this continent, the Great Canadian Shield, are mainly granites and other igneous rocks. 2 million square miles of the Great Canadian Shield region are called by, or so-called, Precambrian rocks, composed in part of pink granite gneiss that was originally intruded in the form of batholiths during the so-called vast mountain-making upheavals. Batholiths, great subterranean masses of intruded igneous rocks. R.C. Hussey, Historical Geography, 1947. A little bit later in history, but far in the past as far as we're concerning at 2022. Nevertheless, relevant. These things didn't happen a couple of days ago. So the descriptions can be very accurate, albeit back in 47. These phenomena are common all over the world and account for a substantial percentage of the Earth's surface rocks, in addition to the intrusive rocks found in every part of the geologic column and the igneous masses underlying the sedimentaries. But the only modern process at all pertinent to these phenomena is that of volcanism, which in its present character could not possibly have produced these great igneous formations. There are perhaps 500 active volcanoes in the world, and possibly 3 times that many extinct volcanoes. But nothing ever seen by man in the present era can compare with whatever the phenomena were which caused the formation of these tremendous structures. The principle of uniformity breaks down completely at this important point of geologic interpretation. Things happen rapidly, then you go, this, that, same old thing. Some manifestation of catastrophic action alone is sufficient. Okay, now we go, evidences of past earthquake activity testify to a worldwide flood. You have an introduction. With regard to earth movements, it is likewise common knowledge that the rock formations of the earth exhibit everywhere profound evidence of great tectonic activity, movements in the earth's crust. Most of the sedimentary strata, not to mention the still more disturbed igneous and metamorphic rocks, have been tilted, folded, and faulted at a tremendous scale, not slow as you go, catastrophically speaking. It is extremely interesting in light of the biblical suggestion of uplift of the lands at the conclusion of the deluge period, to note that most of the present mountain ranges of the world are believed to have been uplifted on the basis of fossil evidence during the so-called Pleistocene or so-called late Pliocene periods. Flint makes this fact the basis for his topographic control theory of continental glaciation. Despite the fact that references are scattered and the data have never been fully assembled, let me just get my glasses clean, the worldwide distribution of these movements is striking. In North America, late Pliocene or Pleistocene movements involving elevations of thousands of feet are recorded in Alaska and the coast ranges of Southern California. In Europe, the Scandinavian mountains were created from areas of very moderate relief and altitude in late Tertiary time. The Alps were conspicuously uplifted in Pleistocene and late pre-Pleistocene time. In Asia, there was great early Pleistocene uplift in Turkestan and the Palmyra and the Caucasus and certain Central Asia generally. Most of the vast uplift of the Himalayas is ascribed to the latest Tertiary period and Pleistocene. In South America, the Peruvian Andes rose at least 5,000 feet in post-Pliocene time. In addition to these tectonic movements, many of the high volcanic cones around the Pacific border in Western and Central Asia and in Eastern Africa are believed to have been built up to their present great heights during the Pliocene and Pleistocene era. R.F. Flint, Glacial Geology and the Pleistocene Epoch, back in 47. Since the Pliocene and Pleistocene are supposed to represent the most recent geological epochs, except that of the present, and since nearly all of the great mountain areas of the world have been found to have fossils from these times near their summits, there is no conclusion possible other than that the mountains, and therefore the continents of which they form the backbones, have all been uplifted essentially simultaneously, and even according to the evolutionary timescale, quite recently. Surely this fact accords well with the biblical movements or statements. Evidence of massive movements in the Earth's crust cannot be explained by uniformitarianism. It just happened so unbelievably fast. Based on predictable rates of erosion, mountain ranges such as the Rocky Mountains should not exist today if you go back millions of years. Another major geologic phenomenon encountered all over the world is the evidence of tremendous crustal movements that must have occurred in the past. Great thicknesses of rocks have apparently been uplifted thousands of feet. Strata have buckled, folded, sometimes been thrust laterally or completely overturned on a gigantic scale. The Great Rocky Mountain chain, especially as developed in the southern Rockies, is essentially a series of great folds. In the eastern part of this country, the Appalachian system of mountains is believed to be the uplifted and eroded remnant of a great geosynclinal trough in which a thickness of some 40,000 feet of sedimentary rocks was deposited. These mountains reveal a very involved assortment of gigantic faults, folds, and thrusts. Similar phenomena are found in nearly every region of the world. The crust of the earth seems to have been distorted, fractured, elevated, depressed, and contorted in almost every conceivable way at some time or times in the past. This is further attested by the great areas of metamorphism in which the original sedimentary of crystalline rocks have been completely changed in form as a result of the gigantic stresses acting in the crust. What's this word? Schizosity. Schizosity, changes resulting in parallel splitting in crystalline rocks, is also attributed to these causes. Nor are these phenomena, which are too familiar to everyone even to require documentation, limited to the land surfaces. It was once supposed that the deep oceans had remained dark, lifeless, and unchanged, save for the finest rain of sediment since the world began. But new knowledge has quite dispelled this view. Across the ocean floor, geophysicists have now traced great fractures, scarps, and rifts, have found scattered volcanic peaks and ranges, and have charted canyons cut by slumps and flows of mud on the continental margins. J. Tuzo Wilson, The Crust in the Earth and Its Atmosphere. Most, if not all, of these diastrophic features, geological deformations, defined as, of the Earth's crust, are believed to be associated with orogenies, which are, let me define, education here in geology, processes of mountain forming. That is, periods of mountain building, says Dr. W.H. Bucher. The most conspicuous and perhaps also the most significant structural features of the face of the Earth are the great belts of folded mountains like those of the Himalayas, the Andes, the Urals, and the Appalachians, and the so-called orogenic belts. Along these long and relatively narrow zones, great thicknesses of dominantly marine sediments have been squeezed together and thrust one upon the other to form highly elongated folds with axes essentially parallel to that of the belt. Bucher, Fundamental Properties of Orogenic Belts. If only I were into geology, these would be fascinating studies. They are fascinating. It is here that the principle of uniformity would appear to be the most inadequate. If it were valid, surely a feature of such prime importance in the interpretation of Earth history as diastrophism and orogeny should be explicable or explainable in terms of some sort of present-day observable and measurable processes, which is now producing incipient Earth movements of some similar kind. But so far is this from being the case, that geologists are still utterly unable to agree on even a satisfactory hypothesis of mountain building. L.H. Adams of the Carnegie Institute said some years ago in his retiring address as president of the American Geophysical Union concerning these problems of orogeny. Many attempts to answer these questions have engaged the attention of the best minds, but the existing answers leave much to be desired. Complicated mechanisms in great variety have been adduced, but in all instances cogent objections have been raised. We have L.H. Adams, Some Unsolved Problems of Geophysics. All this, again, bears very heavily against the notion of uniformity. Furthermore, these orogenic processes cannot be shoved back into the dim recesses of early terrestrial history, but must very recently have been immensely potent. All the major mountain ranges of the present world evidently were uplifted within the most recent eras of geologic history. It has already been pointed out by evolutionists that fossil evidence indicates most of the great mountain chains date from the supposed Pleistocene or late Pliocene at the earliest. The geologic and archaeologic chronologies of the fossil beds which have yielded remains and artifacts of human beings likewise date in many instances from the Pleistocene and even perhaps the Pliocene. And after considering all the human fossil evidence, Zuner concludes, one point is apparent from the table, that the evolution of Homo is not entirely confined to the Pleistocene. We find the definitely human Pithecanthropus group in the lower Pleistocene, and there is some suggestive evidence for the sapiens stock going back to this time. If this proves to be true, the Homo stock as a whole must date from well within the Pliocene. Of course, these are dates that are contrived based on their own past assumptions, and then they try to match the facts and change or ignore the things that can contradict their point of view. So Zuner dating the past.